I'll be continuing with scrimba, and we're gonna learn. Let's see what we're gonna learn.
Props is one of the major topics in React that will help you create reusable and composable React components. And so we'll be spending a pretty good amount of time covering the concept and the syntax of props. And the other major topic we'll be covering in this section is how to create React components from an array of data. This is what will allow us to create those designs, like in our Airbnb design here, where we have a list of items that we won't need to manually update anytime the data behind it changes. Now, before we jump into some of those more crucial topics in React, the first thing we're going to do is spend a bit of time creating the top half of our project here. And I'm going to say something that might shock a few of you, and that is that if you already feel very confident in doing styling in React like we did in the last few screencasts of the last section, I'm going to give you permission to skip the next few screencasts where we talk about designing the nav bar at the top and designing this hero section up here. Now, this isn't a free pass to just skip those sections. If you feel at all like you need additional practice using styling in React, I highly recommend you do not skip those practices. However, I did just want to warn you ahead of time that we will be spending a bit of time working on some of those design aspects before we jump into the main topics for this section. So again, click on the screenshot here to open it in Figma, create a copy in your own drafts, and then let's jump right in.
Let's actually skip all of this then, I guess. Let's see this destructuring. Let's see, or let's just card component, not reusable components. Let's see this.
Before we can continue on with props, we need to take a quick aside to talk about something. We've learned how our components will be returning JSX, which is a special syntax of JavaScript, or rather, it's something that's created by React and allows us to write our React code in a very declarative way. However, one of the most common things that you'll find yourself doing is trying to insert values from JavaScript inside of your JSX. Right now, we just have some text inside of our H1, but let's assume we had a value like first name. Maybe this is Joe, and a last name, say Schmo. Think for a second, how would you change our H1 to no longer say hello world, but instead to say hello Joe Schmo? Well, we can probably see ahead of time that just trying to input first name, last name, or maybe even interpreted as the text content of my, at least surrounding it with a simply enough, I want you to finish up hello Joe Schmo. And actually, let's put an exclamation point in there for a good measure. Pause the screencast and do this challenge. Rid of those, put a space in between, switch back into our JavaScript mode or JavaScript land. And then script, I get the exclamation point as part of my axis will be run as, or rather like on a 12-hour clock. Hit save, and there we go. It's current. I'd probably say something like, depending on the time of day, good morning, good afternoon, or it doesn't take up too much time. All I've done really is created a changeable variable, that time of day. Consider it afternoon, but otherwise it's good night. I should be able to hit refresh, and sure enough, it says good night. I'm going to change that back so that's not so weird. Okay, with that concept, we are primed to now jump back into props and to see what the syntax of props actually looks like.
That's a good joke, but that's not a good joke. Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry that we're still here on the jokes, but I realize there's one more thing we need to cover before we jump back into our section project, and that is how can we pass a prop that is not just a string? The concept of props, like we talked about, is very similar to the concept of attributes in HTML, and with HTML, we always pass in a string as our data type here. However, we are not limited by that in React. So far, we've only done strings. However, because this is JavaScript, it's React, which is JavaScript, we can pass in any JavaScript data type to our components as props. So I want you to think critically here. How might you pass in a prop that wasn't a string data type? Let's say, for example, you want objects. And then you might say, I want to allow people to filter out the puns or only show the puns in my jokes, in which case I might pass a prop called isPun, which is the value true or false. Critically, see if you can figure out how you would figure that out. Script and JSX by isPun equals, and then jump into JavaScript and send in a Boolean value like true. And then I can do the same thing for these others. And then of course for the ones that are, actually I'm struggling now to think if this joke is a pun or not. This might be a pun because it's talking about puns. Anyway, you get the point. By introducing these curly brackets, I can put any JavaScript value in here. So again, if I wanted to had an array of comments, I could say comments equals, and then this can get as complicated as I want. I can say an array of objects, and maybe those objects have an author property, and it's got some author ID, and then the body of the comment itself, and then maybe there's even a title to the comment and whatnot. Of course, it's an array, so it could be multiples of those and so forth. I can even put JavaScript expressions in here to determine what the value being passed into the prop should be. That's getting a little bit more advanced than I want to jump into now, but the point is these curly braces essentially give us free reign to throw any JavaScript we want inside of the curly braces, and whatever that JavaScript expression resolves to is the value that the prop will pass down to our component. So let me fix my syntax error here, and I could even do props.comments.title, and actually that's going to cause an error because I didn't pass, that's going to match props to all of them, but let's do props.comments values. I could even do props.comments.title, and actually that's going to cause an error because I didn't pass a comments prop to all of them, but let's do props.comments, and we'll see we get a bunch of undefines, but one of them has an array of objects. So I think you get the point. That's going to help us as we go back to our Airbnb experiences clone, so that's what we're finally going to jump back into now. Okay, we're finally back to our Airbnb experiences clone. Your challenge is to pass these props that I've outlined here into our card component, and then inside of our card component, receive those props and make use of them. As a little bit of a hint and a heads up, there's a couple instances that we're not passing in strings, or strings that we are passing in that we need to slightly modify in order for them to work. I guess so that's not too cryptic. The image that we're passing in here, you'll notice, is only the title of the image file. It doesn't include any path to the image itself. The astute of you might know that what we're doing here still is requiring us to hardcode data into our component, and in the real world, that's not what we're going to do. However, we haven't quite gotten there yet. In an upcoming lesson very soon, we're going to see a way that this would actually be structured a little more real as now, but without the hard-coded data. Okay, I already know I'm going to cast a string here, I'll flipping back and forth between extension. We're not path further sign image will go. However, I can't just put backticks surrounding everything here because this by using $sign curly braces. That's where my props.image will go. However, I can't just put backticks surrounding everything here because that doesn't make sense in JSX. Now, this is the tricky part. If I surround the backticks because they are a JavaScript expression in curly braces, then suddenly this expression makes sense. I think this is probably the trickiest part of this challenge. I'm hoping it didn't frustrate anyone too much, but I totally understand if it did because it's a confusing back and forth. Remember, up here we're in JavaScript, then we jump into JSX, then with the curly braces we jump back into JavaScript, and that's why I can use my backticks. Inside of JavaScript and inside template strings, I can use the $sign curly braces to insert JavaScript values into this string. I think it's called interpolation. I end my backtick, and then I get out of JavaScript, and I jump back into JSX. Hopefully you can follow all that. I understand if that's confusing. The rest of this should be really pretty straightforward. My rating is right here instead of curly braces inside interpreted as text, and right here from the same. Now, it does kind of look like we don't have this space showing up after our dot, but we won't be too concerned about that right now. Okay, last thing, I'm going to clean up my console log up here, and excellent. We now have a reusable component as long as every time I create an instance of my card, I pass in these props. I should be able to get different cards showing up in my list. Really great work. If you were able to follow along with this entire lesson, I really hope that this has been helpful, and hopefully you are just as excited as I am to learn this because this is getting me really excited for everything that you've learned, especially if you're understanding it. If you are feeling lost, of course, as always, go back, revisit these, and ask lots of questions in Discord. Coming up, we're going to be addressing that issue where currently we are still hard-coding this data into our code here. And so that's the next topic we're going to tackle. This lesson is basically a spoiler alert for what we're about to learn, because we are going to see how we can use the array.map method to take regular JavaScript data and turn it into JSX elements that can be displayed on the screen. And so this felt like a really natural time to do a quick review of the .map method. If it's been a while or you're feeling a bit hazy about the .map method, you can click the screenshot here. That will take you to the MDN docs on the map method. And I would just recommend going through, reading everything they have, playing with the interactive demos they have and everything like that to help bring you up to speed on .map. So what we'll be doing is a series of challenges. I've got 3 challenges here, but instead of just going through everything in one go, I'm going to have you do challenge 1 first, then we'll go through it together, then challenge 2, go through it together, then challenge 3. Remember, the goal is to look at our input data and try to turn it into some output data using the .map method. So pause now and start working on challenge 1. .map. .map going to run a callback function, and I'm going to say that I'm running .original item with will be saving kind of whatever I return from this function, so I'm going to add a return callback map. A function declaration just for, okay, so the first thing we'll do is run nums.map. .map takes a callback function, and I'm going to use a function declaration just for now to better understand exactly what's going on here. And this callback function is going to run for every item in my array that I'm running .map on. And then whatever I return from this function, so I'm going to add a return inside here, whatever I return from this function will get placed at the same index as the original item with whatever kind of modification we make to it. And then in the end, .map returns a brand new array that will be the exact same length as the original array, and so we should probably be saving that. Let's say const, and these are squares, so we'll say squares is equal to the array that comes back from calling nums.map, and then this function will be taking a look at every item, or probably better is to say it's going to look at each number, or not. We should get our output in array, and then we will have it return num in an array, and string is capitalized. Pause and work on challenge number 2. Capitalize relief to it the more you see characters that we don't need. Rhythm challenge slice, starting everything from that point until the end. Honestly, I'm winging it a little bit, so we'll add index of 1 or one that's something like a new array doing anything, and we'll set that equal to the array that comes back from calling Pokemon.map. And this time let's use an arrow function again. I'm going to look at every single, well, let's see, I think Pokemon is both the singular and the plural form of Pokemon, so maybe we'll just call this mon for individual monsters. And let's start out by opening the body of this function like we did before, and then individual monster this, but then in the, okay, we'll funding it and Pokemon.map. And this time let's use an arrow function again. And let's essentially bring here, and if we console log paragraphs, okay, we get an array of, well, they're still just strings, but they look kind of like paragraph elements. Awesome work. Now, if I wanted to clean up my arrow functions, I only have 1 parameter, so I don't need those parentheses surrounding there. And then I could take advantage of my implicit return by moving up the return value here and getting rid of my curly braces. And sure enough, that's much more concise. I can do the same thing up here. Now, this return value is a little bit longer, so you can decide whether or not you actually want to do this, but I can put that up on the next line. Or if you want to use the next line, you can surround your return value in parentheses. So return value mon and surrounding it with the paragraph opening and closing tags. So I'll use a template string here, and we'll put in our paragraph tags like this. But then in the middle, I will just inject the individual string of the Pokemon. And now if we console log paragraphs, okay, we get an array of, well, they're still just strings, but they look kind of like paragraph elements. Awesome work. Now, if I wanted to clean up my arrow functions, I only have 1 parameter, so I don't need those parentheses surrounding there. And then I could take advantage of my implicit return by moving up the return value here and getting rid of my curly braces. And sure enough, that's much more concise. I can do the same thing up here. Now, this return value is a little bit longer, so you can decide whether or not you actually want to do this, but I can put that up on the next line. Or if you want to use the next line, you can surround your return value in parentheses and then start that on the next line, and that should work just fine too. Let's just double check that. Okay, looking great. In fact, I suspect that these aren't actually necessary in the first place. Yeah, I guess the parentheses really aren't that necessary. I think I like them there just for maybe my own sake in keeping things balanced, but you can do it however you want. Okay, now that we've reviewed array.map, we should be perfectly primed to jump right into the next lesson. I think now is probably a good time to remember that JSX just returns a regular JavaScript object. We can see that if I were to set, let's say, what we actually get back is just a plain old JavaScript DOM node that shows up on the properties and the shape of this object get determined by React in order to describe the element that React eventually will be turning into a real DOM node that shows up on our screen. But the reason that I mention this is because when you get deeper and deeper into web development and actually programming in general, you'll discover that most arrays don't end up being an array of simple strings like we sometimes use for examples like this. Instead, it's probably most common to find arrays end up being an array of objects. Let's keep this example simple. We'll say it's a first name and present pieces of data in a lot. We'll know how to essentially map over that array and turn it into elements. Let me clean some of this up and show you a little bit more of what I mean. Let's say we create this array of colors, and I'm just going to put in the colors of the rainbow. Of course, I can give React that don't have an array of strings, but this is just an age. Now, I could have just done this in its place. So we'll take this one step at a time. Let's look at it this way. Now, obviously, this is not beautiful, and we can tell already that it's essentially just putting these together as blank text. I haven't taught React that I want these to be paragraphs or headers or ordered lists or anything like that. Now, of course, if I do want to use my variable colors up here, I can essentially just put colors here, and I still, of course, leave my curly braces here. When I hit save, I get the same result. But now I want you to do a little challenge to experiment with what will happen if you change these from strings into JSX elements. Okay, simple enough. I just want you to essentially change these strings into JSX elements, and I said h3. You can do whatever element you want. H3s. In some ways, it's kind of like React this way, but let's put it back to colors so that it works the way it's supposed to work. Okay, now we are poised to take what we just talked about and reviewed with .map and what we just learned about where React can render an array of JSX elements and put those concepts together, which will allow us to, instead of hard coding our data directly into our React can render an array of JSX elements and put those concepts together, which will allow us to, instead of hard coding our data directly into our components like we're doing here, instead we can get data from outside of our little system, map over it, and render a new component for every piece, and we'll get to pull those in and map over. Let me walk you through a couple of changes I made to the code that we were just looking at. Of course, you probably noticed I moved all of our hard-coded joke components outside of our component here and just commented them out so we can still use of the data that comes. Also changed our jokes.markdown file into a jokesdata.javascript file. Now, we're not quite ready to make API calls and then make use of the data that comes back, so I'm going to be kind of mimicking that with this jokes.js file that's exporting an array of these joke objects. Over in our app.js, I'm going to import the jokes, I'll say jokes data, from that file, /jokes data, and we can see that if I console log jokes data, I should get the array of jokes. Okay, great. Now, combining what we just learned with .map and with creating an array of JSX elements, I can put those two concepts together. What I'm going to do is create what I call jokesdata.map so we can see a little more clearly what's a joke component. So maybe this is a good opportunity, and then of course, for you to put on your thinking cap and do a quick little challenge. Your challenge is to see if you can pass the props to our joke component in the correct way, and then of course, render our joke elements array so that when you're all done, all of our jokes show up on the page again.
So I guess you can see the joke.js and it takes props.setup. And punchline. I don't know.
Pause the screencast and see if you can complete this challenge. Inside of I can say this, now it shows in my app.js, I would still say setup because I'm the one that gets to choose what the prop names, but my component is. But then my actual data would need to change to punchline. And this is now not quite elements. Hit save, and there we go. We've got all of our jokes back on the page. Now, if I clean some of this up, you can see just how much simpler this makes our lives as React developers. And then if I were being really stingy, I could use the implicit return to just return my joke element. I'm not going to worry too much about that, especially because it makes it a little too wide horizontally there. Awesome. Okay, we have taken a number of asides. Once again, I'm going to bring us back to our Airbnb experiences clone, and we're going to take this concept and actually build these separate experiences in their own cards. This time, using data that we get from a file instead of hard coding things into our code. Concept and actually build these separate experiences in their own cards. This time, using data that we get from a file instead of hard coding things into our code. Make sure you have studied this and understand it before you move on. And when you're ready, let's jump back into our section project.
Okay. So I just need to learn arrays and then I can do that. But I really need to learn that. How do I do arrays? Let's see.
All right, it's time for another quiz. We're going to look at the .map array method. Array map array. Speaking our callback function, we could just hard code something like return the string hello, and then we would have an. With that in mind, number 2 asks, what do we usually use .map for in React? Well, in web applications, it's really common. So in React, we'll take an array of data. It allows us to convert an array of raw data into an array of JSX elements that can be displayed on the page. And number 3, why is using .map better? If you think in terms of something like Amazon, every time a new product is uploaded to Amazon and Amazon sells that product, there isn't a developer out there who's, if you think in terms of something like Amazon, every time a product convert that, meaning that I equal 0, and then we use I as require intervention instead of 5, but I'm looking at, so I'm just going to our section project. I am coming to you from the future again because in the next challenge, for anybody who is following along using Create React App on their local machine instead of following along here in Scrimba, the upcoming challenge might throw you for a bit of a loop, technically speaking. What we're about to do is go back to the Airbnb project and use a data file that includes links to the local images so that you can map over it and display those images as well as the other pieces of data. And you'll see that just kind of works out of the box here in Scrimba. But if you're following along with Create React App, you'll get something that looks more or less like this. Obviously, this is not ideal. The last time that I spoke to using Create React App, I mentioned how it's gently advised against putting any assets inside of the public directory. However, this is an instance where I'm just going to recommend that you put your images inside of your public directory. I'm going to go to the next slide. This has any assets inside, it's more or less like this. Obviously, this is not ideal. The last time that I spoke to using Create React App, I mentioned how it's gently advised against putting any assets inside of the public directory. However, this is an instance where I'm just going to recommend that you put your images inside of your public directory. I'm going to go to the next slide. This has an animated GIF that might take a minute for some people to load. But you can see that what it's doing is it's taking the images directory from the source folder and moving it up into the public folder. The reason I'm recommending doing this is, well, first of all, normally you're not going to have a data file that includes all of the data you need. Instead, you would actually be getting that data from some online resource. And second of all, because it just magically works. When you move the images to the public folder, things just kind of start working again. So that was just a quick heads up for anybody using Create React app. If you're following along here in Scrimba, you really don't have to worry about any of that for now. Okay, with that said, let's jump in. Okay, it all comes down to this. We are going to put all the things that we just learned together to progress our section project here with the Airbnb Experiences clone. I've written out your task here, and let me walk you through just a couple things. First of all, there's now a data.js file, and this contains an array of the objects that represent the data that we're going to be displaying on the screen. Part of your task is to import that data as it mentions, map over it to create our card components, kind of like we have hard-coded here, and then render that array in place of this card component. One little change that I did make is I changed the country prop to location, and I also made that change in the data here, so in case you were curious about why that's changed, I just decided it made more sense since we might have some online experiences. And another thing is you'll notice there are some properties here that we won't yet be using, like open spots or description. That's okay. For now, just ignore those. We'll decide later if we want to make use of them. Also, as I mentioned in the note here, because we haven't done styling to our group of components or anything like that yet, they're going to stack on top of each other because they're block element divs. For now, that's okay. Don't worry about them being stacked vertically. We'll fix that later. Okay, now is the time. I know that you can do it. You've worked hard up until this point. Hopefully, you have stepped the word data as sure that getting this in how to in our component we call the and then for having these hard-coded values, I will just replace them with the values from our object. So let me just make sure that I get all these properties where the data had a this is called what we chose to call our prop that we're passing into our component. That's entirely okay, and actually ends up being pretty common, especially if you're not thrilled with the way that the data was designed. Oftentimes, you're consuming data that someone else has put in their database, and you don't get to choose these property names. Okay, our array count item.stats.title, I believe, was item.title, and this, I believe, was item.price. Let's just double check those. I like to double check them because otherwise you might see missing data and then get really confused about why it's not working. Title, and price. Okay, now that we have created our array of card components, we need to render it. So I'm going to put that in curly brackets, unique data, so far, stand it. That being said, we do have a couple more things that I want to cover before we finish off this section. First of all, we need to style this, so we'll do that in the next screencast. And then I want to give you a sneak peek into some of the topics we'll be talking about in the next section.
Key prop.
Okay, I've got to be honest with you. I was going to have you style the list of cards here so that they would horizontal scroll inside of a container. But we've already spent a pretty fair amount of time doing CSS inside of React. And so for all the hard work and effort that you have put in so far, I've got a little present for you. Bam, we've got the styling done. Of course, if you're interested to see how I did this, basically I made a flex container, made it so that none of the items would grow or shrink as the container got bigger or smaller, and then just set the overflow to scroll, essentially. You can check the CSS for the details on it. I've also included little tags that will tell you exactly what I added so that you could easily see what actually changed.
Amazing. So let's. So to create a website like that, you just have to do this. Nice. So display flex direction on overflow. I don't know overflow. Maybe I don't know why he said that. Okay. Huh. So overflow is hidden and text overflow ellipses. I don't know what that means.
Smaller, and then just set the overflow to scroll, essentially. You can container, made it so that none of the items would grow or shrink as the container styling done. Of course, if you're inside of React. And so for all the hard work and effort that you have put in so far, I've got a little present for you. Bam, we've got the styling done. Of course, if you're interested to see how I did this, basically I made a flex container, made it so that none of the items would grow or shrink as the container got bigger or smaller, and then just set the overflow to scroll, essentially. You can check the CSS for the details on it. I've also included little tags that will tell you exactly what I
I'll see that later.
added so that you could easily see what actually changed. Also notice that I used a section element here to surround our cards. That allowed me both to give this a class name and give it specific styling, but it also allowed me to make use of our styles that we put way back in the beginning on sections so that it had some padding on the left and right. Now there are two things that I want to talk about here. One is how awesome it is that we are now mapping over our data, because it means that if the data ever changes, our page will automatically update. So if I were to, for example, paste in 3 more items here, I just copied the one and pasted it again, and then updated, our page is going to automatically update with all of the new activities that are included in our data. Clearly, this is a much better way to work as a developer where the data will change and your page doesn't need to. Your code actually stays exactly the same, and all that really updates is how that data is being used to display your elements on the screen. The second thing that I want to cover is this error that we have been seeing, or rather a warning that we've been seeing that says each child in a list should have a unique key prop. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this course to dive deep into why this key prop is necessary, but you will see this warning anytime you are using .map on data to create JSX elements, or rather an array of JSX elements. First, let me go to data.js and get rid of those 3 extra items we had. Now over on our card, the way we can get rid of this warning is by simply adding a prop called key, and it very specifically needs to be key, K-E-Y. And I need to set key equal to something unique about this individual item. And it very specifically needs to be key, K-E-Y. And I need to set key equal to something unique about this individual item. In this case, pretty much everything about these different experiences is unique. The image is different, the title, the price. However, for example, the rating is not different between this first one and the second one, so that's not something I could use as my key because it's not unique. Fortunately, when we're pulling data from a database, almost always we'll receive some kind of ID property that we can guarantee will be unique because the database is treating that as a unique property in the database. Now, obviously, I typed all this in manually, but I gave it an ID so that we could mimic this concept. Over in app.js, I'm going to assign the key to be item.id. Again, I probably could have used the title or the price for this warning to go away, but when I hit save, we'll see that warning disappears. So those were just a couple of miscellaneous items that I wanted to cover. I'm not going to put our hero back in quite yet because there is one more thing that I want us to talk about, and that touches again on a sneak peek of conditional rendering, and we'll talk about that in the next class.
Sold out badge.
A phrase you might hear from the React community is that people love React because it's just JavaScript. Now, of course, under the hood, there's things like JSX, which is a little bit of magic being performed by React. But I wanted to show you what that means by giving you another sneak peek at conditional rendering. Now, I've updated the little screenshot that I have here to show you this little badge down here that says sold out. And you might have noticed that in the data, we actually have a property called open spots. Now, I intentionally set this first one to open spots of 0 so that we could conditionally render this little badge if the open spots is ever 0. You might remember from the first time I did a little sneak peek on conditional rendering, the term is referring to when we only will sometimes render a part of our page. Right now, everything on here will render every time this component gets called. However, what we can do is take a look at props, and if props.openspots, let's say, is equal to 0, then we can display the little sold out badge. Otherwise, we just won't display it at all. Now, there's 2 parts that we need to make this work. First of all, over in app.js, we aren't currently passing in the data from OpenSpots into our card component. So the first thing we need to do is create a new prop called OpenSpots, set that equal to item.OpenSpots. Another thing you may have noticed is that we sure are passing a lot of data from our item component. We're going to cover a set that equal to item.OpenSpots. Another thing you may have noticed is that we sure are passing a lot of props into this component. We're going to cover a truncated way to essentially do the same thing without having to add a new prop to our card component every time we want some data from our item. But for now, we'll stick with what we know. So we now have a prop called OpenSpots. We're passing in that number value from our data right here. Now in our card.js, let's just make sure that this is working. I'll go ahead and console log props.OpenSpots. And check our console, and sure enough, we get 0, 27, and 3 because that's how many open spots there are for each of our experiences. So let me get back to what I meant by it's just JavaScript. First, let's go ahead and actually create a little badge that will float in the upper left of this image. The way I'm going to do that is by setting my card to be position relative and have a div here that's position absolute. Of course, for now, this div will always show up. We'll fix it so that it can dish hard to what I meant by it's just JavaScript. First, let's go ahead and actually create a little badge that will float in the upper left of this image. The way I'm going to do that is by setting my card to be position relative and have a div here that's position absolute. Of course, for now, this div will always show up. We'll fix it so that it conditionally renders as soon as we have something that looks good. Let's go ahead and just hard code in sold out, and I will give it a class name. Let's call it card, probably badge. And honestly, just to save time, I'm going to paste some styles in here so that you don't get too bored. Then on my card, I need to make it position relative, and I need to refresh this. Okay, now obviously it's hard-coded, so every one of these has a sold-out badge, it, position, and honestly, just to save time, I'm going to paste some styles in here so that you don't get too bored. Then,
Wait, position absolute, top 6 pixels, left 6 pixels. Okay. Padding 5, 7, border radius 2.
on my card, I need to, and then essentially included a addition be handled. To save time, I'm going to paste some styles in here. So now, obviously, it's hard-coded, so every one of these has a sold-out badge. And you might remember that the way we handled conditional rendering before was we surrounded our div that we only sometimes want to display in curly braces, and then essentially included a condition beforehand. Now, we used a very short version of that condition, which we'll use again. I can say props.openspots equals 0 and the div that I want to render. This is kind of a clever example of how in React we typically use just plain JavaScript to handle things like the display logic that our component needs to know about. If this first statement is truthy, then this second statement, or this JSX element, will run and therefore get displayed. However, if this first statement is falsy, then the second one will actually never even get called or run, and therefore this div will never display on the screen. So if I hit save, we'll see that now I only have a sold out badge on the element that had exactly 0 spots in it. Technically, because 0 is a falsy value, I could say that if not props.openspots, but that's a little less easy for me to read, and if another developer were to come see this, they might expect openspots to be a boolean, and so I'm going to keep it as triple equals 0 to be very explicit. Now, if you actually go look at the Airbnb Experiences website, you'll notice that even in our design here, we talk about online experiences, and some of our locations are online. The actual website itself has a little badge that says online in order to help people understand that it's going to be, well, probably through a Zoom meeting instead of an in-person live meeting. So I thought I'd show you yet another example of how we can use just plain JavaScript to help determine the display logic of our components here. Right now, I have this badge that says sold out. Now, I could come up with something kind of complicated by putting my display logic in here that says if OpenSpots is 0, then display this div. Otherwise, if the location is online, then display another div. Otherwise, display nothing. But as I was preparing this, I came up with another way that I figured was a little more concise. And so I thought I'd show that here. If you've ever done a code challenge on, well, any number of the websites that exist out there that allow you to practice code challenges, this might feel kind of familiar. My goal is to dynamically render not just this entire div, but also the text inside of it. So I'm going to set a variable using let, and I'll say this is badge text. Then I can just use regular JavaScript and say if props.openspots is equal to 0, then I want badge text to read sold out, or let's put it all caps and say consistent. However, if it's not sold out, I also want it to check if props.location is equal to online. And if it is, then we'll have badge text say online. Now, there's two things that I need to change with this line of code in order to make it so that primarily, if it's sold out, it has badge that says sold out. Secondarily, if the location is online, it displays badge that says online. But otherwise, it displays no badge at all. In fact, let's make this a challenge for you. Okay, your challenge is to display the correct badge text instead of this hard-coded sold out. And secondly, to only display the badge when it's either sold out or an online experience. I've given you some hints basically in the language that I used for this challenge number 2. Pause the screencast and work on these challenges.
Basically, we are.
Okay, for the first challenge to display the correct text, all we have to do is erase sold out and instead render whatever the value of badge text is. Now, of course, currently this will only get rendered if OpenSpots is exactly equal to 0. So we also need to change our condition upon which this gets rendered. Kind of a clever way that I thought of was, well, when we initiate badge text up here, its value is going to be undefined. And then if props.openspots is 0 or props.location is online, then badge text will have a real value. I can use the truthiness of a real value or the falsiness of undefined to just say if badge text exists, or rather if badge text has a real value, then I want you to display badge. Now, maybe this is contrary to what I said before about assuming truthy and falsy values. This one seems a little more logical to me, however. So if I hit save, awesome. Now we have sold out on anything that's sold out. Notice even if it's an online experience, it will prefer sold out first because that's our first condition up here. And then if it does have open spots, but it's online, it has an online badge. And if it's neither, then there's just no badge at all. Now we will be covering conditional rendering in more detail later. However, the point that I'm trying to get across is that in React, we very often use plain JavaScript, like this kind of regular algorithmic JavaScript, to determine how things will get displayed on the page. That might not seem unique or strange to you until you've worked in another framework like Angular or I think Vue as well, where there are actually properties built into the markup that you see that provide logic for using for loops or conditional statements and so forth. I'm not necessarily vying for one over the other, but hopefully this sheds some light into why a lot of proponents of React will say they like it because it's just JavaScript. And along those lines, the next thing we're going to do is go clean up this card component that is getting pretty lengthy. We'll do that in the next lesson.
Why are they not using that question mark, and instead using and I don't know.
When we have a component that's in charge of maybe displaying 1 or 2 pieces of data, it's not that big of a deal to pass each of those pieces of data down individually as separate props. However, we can see our card component is starting to get a bit lengthy. And honestly, we haven't even included things like maybe there's a description or a set of tags that can categorize these experiences. Whatever the case might be, along the theme of React being just JavaScript, what we can opt to do instead of passing each of these properties of our data down individually is we can just say, I'm just going to give this component the entire item object. Notice I kept key here. That's because it's something unique that we need to include anytime we're using map. But for all the other properties of data I need a card to know about, I'm just going to pass the entire item object down. Of course, because I'm changing the structure of my card over here, when I hit save, well, everything is broken now. But if at this point you truly have an understanding of how props works and how the things that we pass down to our components can get received by the component, you should be able to complete the following challenge. Fix our component. I'm intentionally being a bit vague here because I want you to challenge yourself. If you have felt a little bit confused about props and what exactly this object is that we're receiving and so forth, this might be a good indicator that it's time to go back and just review the stuff, practice the stuff that we already learned. But if you have felt pretty confident here, then I want you to pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Bit confusing to read through here, but you'll notice in the console below that there is an item property in our props, so props.item, and that item is the object with all of the properties from. It means that all I really need to do is change anywhere I was referring to individual props as a part of the props object, like props.image. I just need to change it to props.item.image. However, we are going to run into one little problem, and what I'll do first is just change everywhere I see props dot to say props.item dot and then the property there. When we hit save, we'll see where we run into a problem. So it looks like some of it is coming through. We have our title, our price, and our location, but it looks like our review count, our rating, and our image are not working. So if you haven't already figured out why this is broken, I want you to pause the screencast, poke around the code, see if you can figure out how to fix the rest of this component.
I don't know.
Because we are passing in the entire item, we now are beholden to exactly the structure and the property names of our data itself. So for example, in our component, we were saying props.img, but in the data, it's the object.coverimg. So if I replace in my card component img with coverimg, now my images should come back. Similarly with review count and .stats.rate when we're doing this logic and review count, the rest of that should come back the way we wanted it. Now we can see that our badges are still missing, and that's because way up here when we're doing this logic, we also need to add props.item so that we're correctly looking at item.location and item.openspots. See if that fixes it. Awesome. We're back to the way we were, but now our component as we use it is a lot simpler. Awesome work. We are so close to done. There is one more little tweak to exactly what we've done here that you might see pretty commonly in React, and so I wanted to make sure that I covered that before it became really confusing when you saw it in the wild. So that's what we'll cover next. There is one more little trick to passing properties into a component that I wanted to teach you about, so that when you see it in the wild, it's not terribly confusing, because if you don't know about it, it looks rather confusing. This trick has to do with the object spread syntax. And if you are either not familiar with it or it's been a minute since you've done it, it's an ES6 feature, and I've linked here the MDN docs on using the spread syntax with object literals. But the idea is that instead of creating my own prop called item that I pass the entire object down through, what I can actually do is just put a set of curly braces and spread the item into my component's props. Essentially what this does is it takes the properties of the data, like ID, title, description, price, cover image, stats, location, and open spots, and creates a separate prop for each one of them, kind of like we had before we were passing in the item individually. So it would look like ID equals item.id, title equals item.
Oh, that's amazing. I've actually missed a lot of learnings, but it's fine.
Passing in the item individually. So it would look like ID equals item.id, title equals item.title, description, we just changed property in the item that we are passing into our component. Now doing this does fundamentally change exactly what props the card is getting, because, well, we just changed props so that it said props.item because it was receiving an item object prop. Doing it this way means we would basically go back to the way that we had it before. So if I were to go back to that, I do curly braces, item, which spreads all of the properties of this item as separate props into my card component. Back in my card component, I need to go back and get rid of all of my items here. And well, it looks like it's breaking a little deeper than it was before. So then when I make those changes in the correct way, hit refresh, everything's back to the way that it should be working. On a personal note, I do tend to struggle with this method of passing data down to a component, only because it obscures exactly what we're passing to our component. I personally would rather pass the item down as a very explicit, specific prop that says item is item, and although it does clutter my component a little bit where I have props.item.stats.review count and whatnot, I tend to find that, at least for myself, when I go back, I don't need to first go to the data, understand what properties are there, then go to app and see that I'm spreading that in, then go to the card and look at what those properties are. I don't know, maybe it's just a personal preference. I have tended toward passing objects down like the way that I showed here. For your own sake of review, I'm going to put this back to the spread syntax just so you can see what it looks like as the spread syntax. It's saved so we see that it's still working. I'm sure as you write more and more React, you'll settle on which one you like the most, or maybe just stick to a standard in whatever code base you're working in. I'm going to take a second to clean some of this up so that we buy some more horizontal space. And last but not least, let's go back to our app.js component. Let's bring our hero back in, and let's see how things are looking. Awesome. And that, folks, marks everything that we had planned to learn in this section. So before we keep pushing forward in React, let's take just a minute in the next screencast to look back on everything that we've learned in this section and give you a chance to complete another self-assessment project.
Okay, GG's.
Before moving on to the next section, this time without the work on this solo project to help Gabe in learning, I traveled along with some of the duplicate details and a photo from your trip. Clicking on the image of this design will take you to the Figma design file. Once you're there, make sure to click on getting edits to the v.lot, get the data from an API for the title, location, the link for Google Maps, a start date to your trip, end date to your trip, the description, and an image URL. If you're using your own photos, you can actually just drag and drop them into the Explorer in the upper left of this, just so this way you at least know the shape, pass that data down to the customers to be something that you would be proud to show to someone else. For some code feedback, you can Twitch, make sure that you share your work here. That will take a link to your project. I have to wait until you make sure that it's styled and really polished. You want this to be something that you would be proud to show to someone else. And of course, speaking of which, make sure that you share your work. Again, you don't have to wait until you're completely done with the project. You can always share your current progress in Discord and ask for some code feedback. You can click the Discord icon here. That will take you to the I built this channel where you can share your work. Or if you're doing something like learning in public on Twitter, React. Let's look at it so you can write more composable code. But you know the concept of props and reusing components enables us to do is use data to drive the code and map over it in order to create the website. I'm proud of what you have worked on so far. So although there's only 2 topics here in this recap, those topics are extraordinarily important as we move forward. As always, you should be extremely proud of what you have worked on so far. So I highly recommend that you go over to the Discord server. Please say that's completely okay.
Let's start the next screen generator. And